Well, you guys wanted the war. You'll have it now. You ready, Amichai? This is the usual thing, between us. We know each other for many years and we are good friends. The story of the united monarchy of David and Solomon. Allow me to read. It will be okay. Don't worry. It will be a little bit funnier now. The story of the united monarchy of David and Solomon is one of the greatest epics of Western civilization. A young shepherd kills the giant Goliath with a single slingshot, at once saving Israel from the Philistines and becoming our cultural main metaphor for the weak overcoming the mighty. He then flees from the rage of Saul, the first tragic king of Israel, who commits suicide on the battlefield. Conquering Jerusalem, David embarks on an unprecedented campaign of territorial expansion and establishes a great empire. And he receives an exceptional, unconditional promise from God. His dynasty will rule in Jerusalem forever. David's son and successor, Solomon, has likewise captivated Western literary and religious imagination. His wisdom is the standard by which all rulers are rated. His wealth and opulence was reportedly so great, it became the ideal countless later kings attempted to achieve. No wonder that David and Solomon have always been revered in Western tradition. From Constantine to Charlemagne, from the David throne of the kings of England, through the coronation of the Franks at Reims, to the crown of Solomon of the Ottonian kings of Germany, David and Solomon supplied the greatest monarchs of the world with a model of kingship, pious, wise, courageous, but at the same time capable of moral weakness. No king hoped for a better deal. Clever, rich, and the lover of Jida Luluberjida. But is this great epic historically reliable? What if David and Solomon were, as some scholars now contend, legendary characters with no more historical substance than King Arthur or Helen of Troy? Let me start from the end. This lecture presents the view from the center against the conservative or maximalist camp. I will argue that much of the David and Solomon narrative in the Bible cannot be read as a straightforward historical testimony, and that their kingdom was by far more modest than traditionally perceived. And against the minimalist, I will contend that David and Solomon are historical figures, the founders of the Jerusalem Judite dynasty. Part 1, the conventional theory. The quest for the united monarchy, the glamorous empire of David and Solomon, has been the most spectacular venture of biblical archaeology. The obvious place to start the search was, of course, Jerusalem. Yet Jerusalem proved to be a hard nut to crack. The nature of the site made it difficult to peel away the layers of later centuries, and the Temple Mount has always been out of reach for archaeologists. Therefore, the search for the great united monarchy of David and Solomon was diverted to other sites. First and foremost among them, Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley. Megiddo, well, I'm citing Saddam Hussein here, Megiddo is specifically mentioned in 1 Kings 9:15 as having been built by Solomon. Starting over a century ago, Megiddo has become the focus of the endeavor to make flesh and bones of the great Solomonic kingdom. Strategically located on the international highway that connected Egypt and Mesopotamia, Megiddo has been excavated by no less than 4 expeditions and has yielded more biblical monuments than any other site in the biblical lands, walls, gates, palaces, water systems, etc. The Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago excavation at Megiddo was the most comprehensive dig in the history of biblical archaeology. Close to the surface of the mound, the excavators unearthed two sets of large public buildings, each divided into three aisles separated by two sets of stone pillars and troughs. Based on the Megiddo-Solomon linkage in 1 Kings 9:15 and on the mention in 1 Kings 9:19 of Solomon's cities of chariots and horses, PLO Guy, one of the directors of the dig, identified these buildings, now being reinvestigated by our team, as stables and attributed them to King Solomon. The stables paradigm became the ultimate word and the mirror for the great achievements of Solomon for almost 30 years to come. The change, I should say revolution, came with the excavation of Yigael Yadin at Hatzor in the north in the 1950s. Yadin noticed the similarity between the six-chambered city gate that he uncovered at Hatzor and the one that the University of Chicago's team unearthed at Megiddo. Turning to 1 Kings 9:15, which says, and I quote, and this is important, "And this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and the Millo, and the walls of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, and Megiddo, and Gezer," unquote. Well, turning to this verse, Yadin decided to dig Gezer, not in the field, but rather in the old reports of the British excavations in the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, he discovered a similar city gate there, hiding in the plan of what had been described as a Maccabean castle, ostensibly a perfect match between text and archaeology. Yadin did not hesitate anymore and described the three gates as blueprint architecture of the Solomonic era. Yadin proceeded to carry out soundings at Megiddo and revise the stratigraphy and historical interpretation of the Oriental Institute's team. According to him, Solomonic Megiddo is represented not only by the city gate, but also by two beautiful palaces built of ashlar blocks, one discovered by the University of Chicago's team in the 20s, and the other partially traced by him in the 60s and almost fully excavated by us in recent years. Both were found under the city of the stables. Under the city of the stables. Two more finds at Megiddo seem to support Yadin's interpretation. The major city before the city of the palaces, one which still features Canaanite material culture, was destroyed by a terrible fire. And the next city, built on top of the palaces, featured the famous stables. Yadin's interpretation seemed to fit the biblical testimony perfectly. One, Canaanite Megiddo was devastated by David. Two, the palaces represent the golden age of King Solomon. Their destruction by fire should be attributed to the campaign of Pharaoh Shishak to the land of Israel, which is mentioned on the walls of the temple of Amun in Karnak, Upper Egypt, and in 1 Kings 14. And three, the stables, which come after the palaces, date to the early 9th century, to the days of King Ahab, who is reported to have faced the great Assyrian king Shalmaneser III in Syria with a huge force of 2,000 chariots. No wonder that Yadin's interpretation became the standard theory on the United Monarchy. Part 2, why the conventional theory is wrong. Yadin's theory was haunted by severe problems from the outset. First, the city gate at Megiddo seems to have been built later than the gates at Hatzor and Gezer. Simply, it connects to a wall which runs over the two palaces. Second, similar city gates have been discovered at other places in the country, among them sites that date to late monarchic times, that is to say, to the 8th century, after Solomon, and sites built outside the borders of the great United Monarchy, even according to the maximalist view. No less important, all three pillars of Yadin's theory do not withstand a thorough scrutiny. Here is the most crucial citation from Yadin, and I quote, "Our decision to attribute the layer to Solomon was based primarily on the 1 Kings passage, the stratigraphy and the pottery. But when in addition we found in that stratum a 6-chambered, 2-towered gate connected to a casement wall, identical in plan and measurement to the gate at Megiddo, we felt sure we had successfully identified Solomon's city," unquote. We need to deal then with stratigraphy, chronology, and the biblical passage. As we all know, stratigraphy provides us only with relative chronology, that is, what's early and what's late. Unfortunately, I have not seen yet any wall with the tag label giving the name of the king who constructed it. The same holds true for old pots. Unlike the bottles of our own time, they do not carry a label. Here archaeologists have committed the ultimate mistake. Some of them will tell you that the Solomonic strata at Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer were dated according to the well-defined family of vessels that I mentioned yesterday, the red, slipped, and burnished, which dates to the 10th century. And here is a citation again, from the American scholar William Dever, and I quote, "The pottery from this destruction layer included distinctive forms of red-slipped and hand-burnished pottery, which have always been dated to the late 10th century. Thus, on commonly accepted ceramic grounds, not on naive acceptance of the Bible story, we dated the Gezer wall and gate to the 10th century BC." Unquote. Well, the opposite is true. How does Dever know the date of this pottery family? Well, it was dated to the 10th century because it was found in the so-called Solomonic strata. And how does Dever know that these strata were constructed by Solomon? From the Bible. A classic circular argumentation. So we are back to square one. Yadin's stratigraphy and chronology tells us nothing when it comes to absolute chronology. In order to reach a date, we need a find that would anchor the archaeology of Israel to the well-dated monarchs of Egypt and Assyria. The problem is that there is no such anchor for the 10th century. In fact, there is no such anchor between the mid-12th and the late 8th century. Over 4 centuries in the Iron Age. The fragment of the Shoshenk first, or Shishak, these are the infamous red slip burnished pottery. Well, the fragment of the Shoshenk first silly found in the 1920s at Megiddo could have given us an anchor, but it was uncovered out of context. And the same holds true for the Mesha stele from Dibon in Moab, in today's Jordan, and the Hazael inscription from Tel Dan in northern Israel. This means that the connection between the remains on the ground and the historical sequence is established according to one's interpretation of the biblical material. Hence, Yadin's theory rested on the biblical verse, 1 Kings 9:15, and nothing but the biblical verse. I repeat, the entire reconstruction of the great Solomonic state by Yadin and others has been based on a single biblical verse, and even if you are told otherwise, I will show you how it all connects back to this verse. So let us take a look at this verse. There is no question that the material in the book of Kings was put in writing not earlier than the late 7th century, 3 centuries after Solomon. The description of the United Monarchy draws a picture of an idyllic golden age, and that it is wrapped in theological and ideological goals of the times of the authors. We have said that several times in this gathering. Now, is it possible that despite all this, the author did know about Solomon's building activities in the north? The natural answer would be that he could have consulted with the Solomonic archive in Jerusalem. But over a century of archaeological investigations in Judah failed to reveal any meaningful scribal activity before the late 8th century. The idea of a Solomonic archive is therefore no more than a wishful thinking. If this is the case, how should we understand 1 Kings 9:15? I would argue that the author referred to the three most important cities of the northern kingdom in the 8th century, Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer, in order to convey his pan-Israelite notion that the great Solomon ruled from Jerusalem over the entire country, including the lands of the northern kingdom. To sum up this part of my presentation, I am grateful for Amichai Mazar for providing me with this wonderful picture. I can, that's enough for today. I can go. Yadin, stratigraphy, and pottery tell us nothing at all. And the biblical verse tell us nothing about the days of Solomon. As far as I can judge, the conventional chronology rests on somewhat simplistic reading of the biblical text, magnified by wishful thinking. And that is only the beginning of the bad news. The conventional theory raises several historical and archaeological problems. Here are just a few examples. The rise of territorial states in the Levant was an outcome of the westward expansion of the Assyrian Empire in the early 9th century. Indeed, extra-biblical sources leave little doubt that all major states in the region, Damascus, Moab, Ammon, and northern Israel, emerged in the 9th century. It is extremely difficult to envision a great empire ruled from the marginal region of the Judahite islands a century before this process. 2. Affiliating the destruction of the Megiddo palaces with the campaign of Pharaoh Shishak leaves us with no destruction layers in the north for the well-documented assault of Hazael, king of Damascus, on the northern kingdom in the mid-9th century. And most annoying of all, over a century of archaeological explorations in Jerusalem, the capital of the glamorous biblically united monarchy, failed to reveal evidence for any meaningful 10th century building activity. The famous stepped stone structure, usually presented as the most important united monarchy remain, was probably built later. Pottery which dates to the 9th century, according to my interpretation, if not later, was found between its courses. A few walls recently unearthed on the ridge of the city of David above this structure have been interpreted by the excavator Elat Mazar as the remains of a palace of King David. Yet all that can be said about them for sure is that they predate the Roman period. If one wishes to speculate about their date, pottery found in a field that may belong to them may hint at a 9th or even early 8th century BC date. The common pretext for the absence of 10th century remains in Jerusalem, that they were eradicated by later activity, should be brushed aside. Monumental fortifications from both the Middle Bronze and late monarchic times, again 8th century, did survive later occupations. To make a long story short, 10th century Jerusalem of the time of David and Solomon was no more than a small, remote highlands village, not the exquisitely decorated capital of a great empire. Part 3, an alternative theory. So much for the negative evidence. More straightforward clues come from two sites related to the great Omride dynasty of Omri and Ahab in the north, the dynasty which ruled over the northern kingdom in the 9th century. Samaria in the highlands, its capital, and Jezreel in the valley, where the wicked Jezebel was killed and thrown to the dogs from the window of her palace. Ashlar blocks uncovered in the foundations of one of the so-called Solomonic palaces at Megiddo carry unique mason's marks, found in one other building in Israel, the 9th century palace of Omri and Ahab at Samaria. I should stress that we are not speaking about two sites or two strata, but about two buildings. These mason's marks are so distinctive that they must have been executed by the same group of masons. but one palace was dated to the 10th century and the other to the 9th century. There are only two alternatives here, either to push the Megiddo building ahead to the 9th century or to pull the Samaria palace back to the 10th century. The answer to the riddle lies in the biblical source on the building of Samaria by King Omri of Israel. This source must be reliable, since it is supported by Assyrian texts that relate to the northern kingdom as Bit Omri, that is to say, the house of Omri, the typical genre of calling a state after the founder of its capital. Therefore, there is hardly a doubt that down-dating Megiddo is the only option. The recent Anglo-Israeli excavations at Jezreel, located less than 10 miles to the east of Megiddo, revealed equally surprising results. The destruction layer of the royal compound there, dated to the mid-9th century, yielded a rich collection of vessels identical to a Megiddo assemblage which has conventionally been dated to the late 10th century. Again, we need either to push the Megiddo assemblage or to pull the Jezreel one. Since the Jezreel compound is architectonically identical to that of Samaria, it must date to the 9th century. In this case, too, there's only one option then, down-dating the Megiddo palaces to the 9th century. So far, I have dealt with traditional archaeology and biblical exegesis. Can we add to these circumstantial considerations a more accurate method? The answer is positive, and it comes from the exact sciences. In recent years, samples from Iron Age strata from several sites in Israel have been subjected to radiocarbon, that is carbon-14, dating procedures. The results of a large number of readings from Dor on the Mediterranean coast, Tel Hadar on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, Megiddo and Yokneam in the Jezreel Valley, Tel Rehov south of Bet She'an, Chatzor in the north, and Rosh Zayit near Akko were found to be lower by almost a century than expected according to the conventional chronology. Pay attention to the blue. Look for the blue squares. No blue squares. A comprehensive study by the Weizmann Institute and the University of Arizona laboratories has placed the transition from the Iron I to the Iron II, traditionally dated to circa 1000 or 980 BC by Mazar, Amichai Mazar. Well, they placed it circa 900 BC. I would opt for a somewhat earlier date, as you see in the picture, in the late 8th century. Destruction layers which have been conventionally dated to the late 10th century provide dates then in the mid to late 9th century BC. On this we agree. Radiocarbon is also a tricky business. Hence, a teamwork of archaeologists and physicists is obligatory. I have therefore cooperated on this issue with Professor Eliezer Pisetsky of the Department of Physics at Tel Aviv. According to Pisetsky, the data available so far, and I quote, unambiguously support the low chronology hypothesis. The probability that the high chronology hypothesis is correct is well below 1%. I'm very happy with this number. A set of readings from Tel Rehov, provided by Mazar, was interpreted as supporting the conventional dating. Yet the Tel Rehov data can be interpreted as adhering to both dating systems, high and low, as you can see now. But when put on the broader stratigraphic background, the Tel Rehov data, in fact, support the low chronology for the Iron Age strata, my chronology. Circumstantially, by comparing the pottery assemblage, it indicates that the Megiddo palaces should be placed between 900 and 835. 900 and 835. The radiocarbon results fit what I have said before. The date of the Solomonic monuments should be lowered by 75 to 100 years. Chapter 4, why the arguments raised against the alternative dating are wrong. As every new idea, this one too faced opposition from scholars belonging to the conservative school. Yet, with each additional point raised against the law chronology, it became evident that my opponents have no real ammunition. Here are a few examples. One, the density of strata argument. If the date of 10th century strata is lower to the 9th century, too many layers are left in northern Israel for the relatively short period of time until the Assyrian takeover in 732. There are several answers to these arguments, and they are all on the wall, on the screen. Two, I love this one. This is what I call the how can you accept the biblical testimony and reject another argument. Put simply, the question is, how can one reject the historicity of the biblical testimony on the building activities of Solomon and at the same time accept the historicity of the verses on the construction of Samaria by Omri? In this case, too, there are two answers. First, accepting the historicity of one verse and rejecting another is exactly the nature of 2 centuries of biblical scholarship. Second, as I have mentioned earlier, the biblical description of the Solomonic state is idealized, with many references to realities of much later times in Israelite history. The description of the Omride state is minimal, negative, but far more accurate historically. The fact that the Assyrians called the northern kingdom Beit Omri, the house of Omri, referring to the capital which was in turn called after the founder, leaves little doubt as to the identity of the builder of the first palace at Samaria. Several scholars, mainly William Dever, suggested that the law chronology camp is still in a minority. Finkelstein stands alone, he says. The truth is that I am far from being troubled by the idea of standing alone to defend a case which I believe is supported by the evidence. But in order to set the record straight, I am presenting two lists of scholars who came out in print in favor or against my sister, half Mazar on both sides. Looking Can you explain this? Looking at the dream team on my side, looking at the dream team on my side, which includes half Mazar, I can only hope to always be able to stand similarly alone. And one more very meaningful note on this issue. All defections are from right to left. All defections are from right to left. Incidentally, Dever himself has recently started his long, cold voyage of defection. In fact, with Mazar halfway down and Dever defecting, the traditional chronology has gone down. I knew that after the early Israel stuff, before I have to amuse you. Chapter 5 and the last one, I'll be on time. Back to history. What is the meaning of all this for biblical and historical studies? The mention of the house of David in the Teltan Stele from the 9th century leaves no doubt that David and Solomon were historical figures. And there is good reason to accept that many of the David stories in the book of Samuel, mainly the heroic tales and the description of his life as a bandit on the fringe of the Judean highlands, contain genuine early historical memories, which were transmitted orally and put into writing not before the late 8th century and thus absorbed later realities on the way down. But the great biblical story of the united monarchy is left with no material evidence. in the 10th century, places such as Megiddo in the north still featured Canaanite material culture. The kingdom of David and Solomon was no more than a poor, marginal chiefdom, small state, let's call it, centered around a humble village in Jerusalem. The beautiful Megiddo palaces, until recently the symbol of Solomonic splendor, date to the time of the Omride dynasty of the northern kingdom, almost a century later than Solomon. They were probably constructed by King Ahab. This should come as no surprise. Contemporary monarchs, Shalmaneser III of Assyria, Mesha of Moab, and Hazael of Damascus, all attest to the great power of 9th century BC Israel. The biblical story about the reign of the Omride princess Atalia in Jerusalem, which is widely considered to be a reliable historical testimony, indicates that the Omrides dominated the marginal, powerless Judah to the south. The great, powerful, and glamorous Israelite state was the northern kingdom. The wicked... The great, powerful, and glamorous Israelite state was the northern kingdom, the wicked kingdom in the eyes of the biblical historian, not the small and poor territory dominated by 10th century Jerusalem. If there was a united monarchy, it was that of the Omride dynasty, and it was ruled from Samaria. If these are the facts on the ground, what is the origin of the biblical tale of an illustrious united monarchy? In order to answer this question, we need to remember that the biblical narrative of the ancient history of Israel was put in writing in the late 7th century, in the days of King Josiah, who is described in the book of Kings as the most righteous monarch of the lineage of David. The history, known as the Deuteronomistic history, intended to serve Josiah's agenda of centralization of cult in Jerusalem and territorial expansion into the lands of vanquished Israel. It is not difficult to identify the landscapes and customs of late monarchic times, the time of the compilation of the text, and the immediate past, as the stage setting behind the biblical tale of the united monarchy. The stories of Solomon's cities of chariots and horsemen must reflect the memory of the great horse breeding and training facility of the northern kingdom in the 8th century. King Hiram of Tyre must be identified with the only Hiram known from reliable extra-biblical texts, the contemporary of Tiglath-Pileser III in the late 8th century. The story of the trade relations with him was intended to equal the grandeur of Solomon to that of the great monarchs of the northern kingdom. The lavish visit of Solomon's trading partner, the Queen of Sheba, in Jerusalem no doubt reflects the participation of late 8th and 7th century Judah in the lucrative Arabian trade. The same holds true for the description of the trade expeditions to land Defar that set off from Etzion Geber on the Gulf of Aqaba, a site which was not inhabited before late monarchic times. As I have mentioned, the early David stories in the book of Samuel may contain earlier, even 10th century traditions, but they too were put into writing much later and were then inserted into the big history of Israel in the 7th century. At that stage, they absorbed the realities and ideology of their time. The armor of Goliath, for instance, which resembles that of a Greek hoplite of the 7th or 6th century BC, and not an early Aegean warrior, should probably be understood against the background of the service of Greek mercenaries in the army of 7th century Egypt. That was a time when tiny Judah faced mighty Egypt, and the victory of David over the giant Goliath, described as a Greek hoplite, and thus symbolizing the power of Egypt, could have depicted the hopes of Judah in Josiah's time. But why was it so important to project these late monarchic images back into the early history of Israel? The tale of a glamorous united monarchy had an obvious meaning for the people of Judah in the days of the compilation of the text. in a time when the northern kingdom was no more than a memory and the mighty Assyrian army had faded away. A new David, the pious Josiah, came to the throne in Jerusalem, intended on restoring the glory of his distant ancestors. He was about to replay the history of Israel by cleansing Judah from the abominations of the nations and undoing the sins of the past. He could stop the cycle of idolatry and calamity which characterized the history of ancient Israel. He could re-act the united monarchy the way it should have been, in his own ideology, of course, before it went astray. So Josiah embarked on re-establishing a united monarchy. He was about to regain the territories of the now destroyed northern kingdom and rule from Jerusalem over all Israelite territories and all Israelite people. The description of the glamorous united monarchy served these goals. All this may seem as somewhat belittling the stature of the historical David and Solomon, but in the same breath, we gain a glimpse into the grandeur of the northern kingdom, the first true great Israelite state. And no less important, we are given a glimpse into the fascinating world of late monarchic Judah. Thank you.